In the early summer of 1996, Elk Valley, West Virginia, was the kind of place where doors stayed unlocked and kids disappeared for hours without a second thought. The town sat quietly in the folds of the Appalachian Hills, its old coal mining route slowly being overgrown by vines and thyme. That morning, 4 boys, ages ranging from 9 to 13, left home with backpacks stuffed with crackers, water bottles, and a few flashlights. It was the first Monday of their summer break. No school, no chores, just a full day to explore. 2 of them were brothers, Eli and Travis Murphy. The third was their cousin, Kevin Fields, and the fourth, Cody Bell, lived 2 doors down. They had planned the outing for weeks, ever since hearing that an old rail path near the edge of the Dry Rock mine had been cleared of brush by volunteers. It wasn't marked on any official trails, but in a town like Elk Valley, kids always knew more than maps did. When the boys didn't come home for lunch, no one panicked. It was typical for them to stretch their freedom as far as the sun would let them. But by 6:30, when the Murphy boys' father stood on his porch calling out names into the woods and heard only birds, a quiet unease set in. By dusk, 3 families were knocking on doors, driving old roads and retracing routes the kids were known to bike. Flashlights flickered into the tree line, and unanswered calls echoed into the hills. Around 9 p.m., Eli and Travis's mother called the sheriff's office. Her voice, as it was later transcribed in the incident report, cracked only once, when she said, "They're always home by now." Deputies arrived by 10, set up a command post in the community church parking lot, and launched a midnight grid search. Neighbors joined. By morning, nearly 50 people were combing the woods, following the old rails and marking tire tracks in the dirt. The sheriff, Clay Branner, said in his first press statement that they believed the boys had gotten lost and that they were optimistic. Search dogs were flown in from Charleston. Helicopters circled the valley. But despite near constant searching, no one found anything. Not a bike, not a scrap of fabric, not even a broken branch that seemed out of place. It was like they had been swallowed whole. By the second day, volunteers widened the perimeter. A weathered map of the abandoned Dry Rock mine was passed around, a relic from a now-defunct company that had sealed most of the shafts decades earlier. Some of the older locals warned that parts of the forest near the mine weren't safe, that entire ridges could collapse in on themselves. Still, the search continued. Old miners pointed out trails long forgotten, places the kids might have stumbled into, but if they had, they wouldn't have stumbled back out. On day 3, a momentary ripple of hope came when a volunteer spotted a flash of red deep in the underbrush, a plastic reflector clipped to the back of a child's bike. It was partially buried beneath damp leaves less than 2 miles from the mine entrance. Cody's name was scratched into the underside with a knife. His parents were called to confirm. They did. But that hope drained quickly. The bike showed no sign of struggle, no footprints nearby, no tracks leading away. It was as if it had been placed there and left. The area around the Dry Rock mine became the new focal point. It was fenced off and marked with rusted signs warning of unstable ground, cave-ins, and poisonous gas. But in a town where curiosity outweighed caution, the mine had long been a teenage dare spot. Stories of collapsed tunnels, hidden doors, and a miner who'd vanished inside decades ago were part of local legend. And now, 4 more names would be whispered in the same breath. By the end of the first week, the official search began to wind down. A few law enforcement officials quietly shifted focus from search to investigation. Foul play was not ruled out. Detectives questioned neighbors, reviewed juvenile records, and re-interviewed anyone who'd spoken to the boys in the 48 hours before they vanished. No leads, no ransom calls, no evidence of anyone following them. It wasn't just that the trail had gone cold. It had never warmed up to begin with. What began as a frantic search now hovered like fog over the valley. Parents left porch lights on through the night, schools held moments of silence, and across town, people locked their doors for the first time in years. Whatever happened in those woods that June, no one saw it, no one heard it, but everyone felt it, that something was wrong. And whatever had taken those boys didn't leave behind a trace. The morning after the bike was found, search crews shifted all remaining resources toward the perimeter of the old Dry Rock mine. It was the closest thing they had to a lead. The mine had been decommissioned in 1972 after a series of partial collapses and budget cuts forced the company to abandon it. Over the years, fences had rusted and warning signs had faded, but the local kids still knew where the entrances were, at least the ones that hadn't been buried under rock slides or closed off with concrete. Officials quickly realized that most of the terrain around the mine hadn't been surveyed in decades. Even the original maps varied depending on who you asked. Some showed 3 shafts, others showed 5. By the time the search reached its peak on day 5, geologists and former miners were being brought in just to identify what was stable and what wasn't. A small ventilation shaft, choked with weeds and rusted to the point of collapse, was flagged by a volunteer who noticed the surrounding grass had been recently flattened. Less than 15 feet from the shaft, another child's bike was found, its chain snapped and front tire bent inward. It was lying on its side, half hidden in the underbrush. It belonged to Kevin, the cousin. His name had been written in black marker on the underside of the seat. This time, no one celebrated. The mood had changed. Even though they were closer to the mine, closer to something that felt like a lead, there was no comfort in how the bikes were turning up. They weren't discarded in a rush or hidden in panic. They were placed, almost deliberately, and each one was found deeper into the woods. Sheriff Branner held another press conference that evening. His tone was flatter, stripped of the hopeful urgency he had just days earlier. He stated that no foul play had been ruled out. While the possibility of an accidental fall into an unmarked shaft remained, they were also investigating whether the boys had been lured or followed. But behind closed doors, search leaders admitted they were running out of logical options. The mine itself was proving nearly impossible to breach. All 3 of the known ground-level entrances had either caved in during the 1980s or were welded shut with thick iron plates. The ventilation shaft, too narrow for an adult to descend, was tested with cameras, but the feed went black less than 30 feet down. According to old reports, the shaft likely dropped vertically for hundreds of feet before opening into the lower levels of the mine. If the boys had entered through it, they wouldn't have climbed back out. A special team from the Department of Mines arrived by the end of the week to assess structural risk. Their verdict: too dangerous. Any attempt to blast through the mine's sealed entrances could trigger a collapse. The mine had no oxygen system, no maps anyone trusted, and no easy way to confirm whether any human had been inside it in the last 20 years. Despite that, several volunteer rescuers pushed back, believing at least one of the boys could have been injured and trapped below. But without concrete signs of life, the mine remained sealed. It was an impossible decision: keep searching and risk lives, or accept that whatever had happened was now hidden beyond reach. By the 10th day, the families began to fracture under the weight of silence. Some clung to the idea that the boys had gotten lost and were surviving in the woods. Others believed someone had taken them. Rumors swirled. An old hermit spotted 2 counties over with a child in tow, a truck seen leaving the forest late that night. None of it held up. Search efforts slowed. Volunteers grew fatigued. Resources were diverted back to larger departments. The forest, once echoing with voices and dogs and helicopter blades, went quiet again. The official statement from law enforcement read that no definitive evidence places the children inside the mine, and that investigative efforts are ongoing. But for the parents, especially for the ones who stayed up every night staring out their windows, the mine became more than just a theory. It became a kind of gravitational pull, an explanation that was horrible but tangible, a place where something could still be found. As summer passed, children in town were kept closer to home. Schools reopened with fewer students. The news moved on. But the mine never left the story. Every time the case was mentioned, on TV, on flyers, in whispers at grocery stores, it came back to that shaft. The one place no one could get into. The one place no one could rule out. And as the weeks faded into months and the boys' faces slowly came off bulletin boards, the shaft remained sealed, holding its silence like a secret waiting to be broken. In the weeks that followed, with official search efforts winding down and no new evidence surfacing, the town of Elk Valley turned inward. The facts had dried up, but the whispers hadn't. People began talking, quietly at first, and only among those they trusted. Some remembered seeing the boys in the days leading up to their disappearance, cutting through fence gaps or walking the wooded trails behind the mine's west slope. These weren't official hiking trails. They were old utility roads, logging switchbacks, and forgotten routes once used by miners, or more recently by people looking to avoid being seen. They were called the trespass trails, and even among adults there was a kind of unspoken agreement. You stayed out of the hollow unless you had a reason to be there. A woman who lived on the edge of Parker Road came forward to say she'd seen the boys riding down a narrow trail behind the mine a few days before they vanished. She didn't think much of it then. Kids played in those woods all the time. But now she remembered how they'd been carrying small flashlights and how one of them had stopped to tie a shirt around his mouth like a mask. That same week, an anonymous letter was left under the door of the sheriff's office. It was typed, unsigned, and full of vague warnings about what's buried out there. It claimed the boys had gone looking for something they shouldn't have found, something someone wanted to keep sealed. Most investigators dismissed it as a crank letter. But it wasn't the only one. As the rumors gained traction, an older man named Jack Darby approached the Murphy family with something more concrete. Jack had worked at Dry Rock in the late 60s and early 70s and was one of the last men pulled from the mine before it was shut down permanently. He was now in his 70s, half blind in one eye, and lived in a mobile home less than a mile from the mine entrance. Jack claimed there were at least 2 vertical shafts not listed on the official maps. One of them, he said, had been welded shut in a hurry after an accident killed 2 workers. They didn't mark it on the papers, he told a retired deputy who followed up. It was sealed for a reason. When asked why the company would cover it up, he shrugged and said, "That's what they did back then, bury the problem." Jack also mentioned something that stuck with investigators. The hollow behind the mine, he said, wasn't just a dumping ground for old equipment. During the years when the mine was winding down, he recalled rumors of barrels, chemical waste, he assumed, being dropped into the deep shafts. No one dared ask questions. You didn't challenge the company. But some of those barrels, Jack believed, were dumped after the mine had officially closed. He said there were men who still had access, quiet men who came at night. Whether any of this was connected to the boys' disappearance, no one could say. But it gave the story a new shape. Maybe the kids had stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see. Maybe someone had made sure they never walked out. The FBI entered the picture briefly in early July. A missing persons unit from Quantico was dispatched to assist, citing the number of victims and the potential for interstate abduction. Their presence was felt immediately. Black SUVs, boxes of files, and agents who asked questions in a different tone. They interviewed known sex offenders within a 100-mile radius, reviewed traffic camera footage from highways leading in and out of Elk Valley, and quietly dug into the mine's ownership records. Some believed the Bureau was looking for evidence of a broader crime, human trafficking perhaps, or an environmental cover-up. But whatever they hoped to find, it didn't materialize. After just 3 weeks, the agents packed up and left. Their report, marked confidential, cited insufficient federal interest. The vacuum they left behind was filled with more speculation. In town, the conversation turned darker. Some believed the boys had been taken and hidden in the mine, not by accident, but with intent. Others believed the mine itself had collapsed around them and that officials were too afraid, or too liable, to admit it. Cody Bell's uncle started printing flyers with the words, "What are they hiding?" stamped across the top. He left them in diners, laundromats, even on the church bulletin board. Others followed suit. Town meetings devolved into shouting matches. Grief turned into blame. And slowly, the focus began shifting away from the boys themselves and toward what might have been buried with them. What began as a tragedy was turning into something else entirely, something poisoned by secrets, decades of mistrust, and the weight of 4 missing children. The truth, it seemed, had gone underground, and whatever was waiting in those tunnels was staying quiet. 5 days after the last official search crew pulled out of Elk Valley, a woman hiking alone in the Upper Breaks National Forest called 911 from a payphone at a gas station 30 miles away. Her voice was shaky but composed. She told the dispatcher she'd seen a boy on the ridge above Honey Creek Trail, shirtless, thin, and waving both arms. When she tried to approach, he disappeared behind a rock formation. She shouted, waited, then kept walking uphill. But there was no sign of anyone when she got to the top. No voices, no footprints, just silence. She didn't know anything about the missing boys until she got back to town and saw their pictures posted in the gas station window. She swore it was one of them. She said his arms looked sunburned, his hair was short, he looked scared. The sheriff's office responded immediately. A chopper was dispatched by the end of the day, and by morning, another temporary command post was set up in the clearing below the ridge. Search teams were redeployed with thermal drones and cadaver dogs, retracing the woman's reported route. They found no fresh prints and no signs of recent human activity until the third day. Deep in a clearing just west of the ridgeline, searchers found a flattened sleeping bag, sun-bleached and partially buried under a layer of leaves. It looked old but intact. Nearby, tucked behind a fallen log, was something far stranger, a line of small animal bones, raccoon, squirrel, rabbit, arranged in a curling arc around a cluster of rocks. Some had been stripped clean, others still had remnants of fur clinging to the bone. It wasn't just the presence of the bones that unsettled investigators, it was the placement. Precise, intentional, like something someone had spent hours working on. Photos were taken. The sleeping bag was collected and later determined to be a model sold in the early 1990s, though the fabric tag had long worn away. No blood, no clothing, no backpacks, no sign of who had used it or when. When the woman who made the call was brought back to the scene 2 days later, she said it looked different now. The air felt off. She kept pointing to the tree line, saying he had stood right there. But no one else could see it. The media picked the story back up immediately. Within 24 hours, the sleeping bag and the bone arrangement became front-page news across the region. National outlets called it the first real lead in weeks. Cable anchors speculated whether one or more of the boys had survived and had been living feral in the woods. Online forums exploded with theories, some rooted in survival psychology, others in something darker. Could someone have been keeping the boys alive out there, moving them from site to site? Was the arrangement of bones a kind of signal, a warning, a message? The parents, still raw and suspended between grief and hope, had mixed reactions. Some clung to the possibility. Eli and Travis's mother began walking sections of the ridge every morning before work, just in case. But the investigators by then were quietly losing faith. Forensic teams found no human DNA on the sleeping bag. The bones were all from small animals, with no indication of cooking or fire pits nearby. There were no torn food wrappers, no water bottles, no signs of long-term habitation. It felt staged, one agent reportedly said, like someone wanted them to find it. The FBI reviewed the evidence again and opted not to reopen their case file. The woman who'd made the call was interviewed twice more and eventually dismissed as credible but unprovable. With no new sightings and nothing tangible to pursue, the case officially went cold in August of that year, just 2 months after the boys vanished. But the image stuck with people. A single boy on a ridge, a sleeping bag buried in the woods, bones in a spiral, laid out by hands no one could see. It added another layer of dread to a case already thick with silence. Some wondered if it had been real. Others thought it was a trick of the light, a moment of misplaced hope. But for those who had searched, and for the families who still waited for answers, it reopened something they'd just begun to bury. The idea that maybe, just maybe, one of the boys had been alive. And if he had been, the question no one could answer was, where did he go next? By 2001, Elk Valley had changed. The 4 boys' faces, once posted on every telephone pole and gas station window, had faded under sun and rain. 2 of the families eventually left. Kevin Fields' parents sold their house and moved to Cincinnati. Cody Bell's mother remarried and left the state without telling most of her neighbors. Their goodbyes were quiet. No announcements, no memorials. Just empty driveways and drawn curtains. But not everyone left. Eli and Travis Murphy's mother, Lorraine, stayed. She refused to sell their house, the same one with the peeling white porch where the boys had eaten popsicles that last June afternoon. Over time, she replaced the curtains, repainted the living room, but left their bikes in the garage untouched. She became the constant. The name that kept coming up every time the case was mentioned, the one who never let it die. Every year, on the anniversary of the boys' disappearance, Lorraine organized a search. Not through official channels anymore, those had dried up, but through volunteers, retired deputies, and people who still cared. Some years only 5 people showed up, others a few dozen. They combed the woods around Dry Rock, crossed old ridgelines, revisited creek beds and service trails. Nothing new ever turned up. But Lorraine documented everything: times, routes, weather, equipment. She kept it all in binders stacked in her front hallway, labeled by year. Deputies who'd worked the case said she probably knew the terrain better than anyone by now, including the search teams who came before. In 2009, Lorraine took it a step further. After saving for nearly 2 years and cashing out a small life insurance policy from her late husband, she hired a private geophysical survey firm from North Carolina to conduct ground-penetrating radar scans of the mine perimeter. It wasn't easy. The terrain was uneven, the equipment expensive, and most companies refused to get involved once they heard it was tied to an open missing persons case. But one agreed. Under the condition, they stayed above ground and avoided areas flagged as unstable. Over 3 days in early October, the team scanned 2 acres surrounding the collapsed west slope of the mine. The results were unclear at first. Dozens of anomalies showed up: buried machinery, mineral pockets, tree root networks. But one section caught their attention. Near a concrete slab that had cracked and sunk several inches into the ground since the early 2000s, they detected what the technician described as a hollowed cavity. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a single-car garage, but it sat roughly 15 feet beneath the surface and appeared to have sharp vertical and horizontal angles, not consistent with natural formations. The report listed it as a man-made void. Lorraine believed it was a sealed chamber, possibly a collapsed entrance, possibly something deeper. She forwarded the results to the sheriff's office and offered to pay for excavation herself. They declined. Too dangerous, they said. The ground was unstable, and opening anything beneath the mine's edge could trigger a slide. Even the state geologist refused to authorize a permit. It was marked as inconclusive. Lorraine kept pressing. Local news picked up her story, and she appeared on a regional talk show where she held up the scan images and said, "This is where my sons are." She looked tired, but composed. Her voice didn't crack. She had passed the stage of grief that begged for miracles. She just wanted the truth. The community responded with a mix of sympathy and fatigue. Some quietly admired her resolve. Others whispered she had lost touch. The truth was, most people had moved on. Kids who were in elementary school during the summer of '96 had grown up, moved out, and started families. The mine had become less a mystery and more a cautionary tale, something told to newcomers and babysitters to keep children close to home. But Lorraine never stopped. Every year, she sent copies of the radar report to newly elected officials. Every 6 months, she requested updated permits to dig. Every week, she walked the edge of the concrete slab, the one with moss growing through its cracks, and marked where the ground shifted. No one else had seen what she saw, but she didn't need them to. For her, the proof had already surfaced. It just hadn't been uncovered yet. And beneath that quiet, cracked slab, something still waited. Whether anyone would ever go deep enough to reach it, that was another question entirely. By the late 2010s, the 4 missing boys from Elk Valley had become more than a cold case. They had become a mystery passed down like folklore, reshaped by the internet and reanimated by people who'd never even been to West Virginia. Message boards, Facebook groups, and YouTube channels dedicated to unsolved cases began picking up the story again. Some reposted old news clips and scanned flyers. Others began linking the disappearances to broader theories, claims that the Dry Rock mine was used for military storage during World War II, that it hid classified waste, or that certain sections of it were deliberately omitted from geological surveys. The tone shifted from tragedy to suspicion. The boys weren't just missing anymore. They were evidence of something bigger, something hidden. Among the most persistent voices was a channel called Digging Deeper, run by a small group of urban explorers out of Pennsylvania. They specialized in infiltrating abandoned sites, factories, tunnels, fallout shelters, and documenting what they found. Their tone was sensational, but their audience was growing. In 2018, they released a three-part series titled The Mine That Ate Four Boys. In it, they laid out their theory that the boys had found a hidden section of the mine not listed on maps, and that the mine company, or someone affiliated with it, had deliberately buried the entrance. They highlighted inconsistencies in the original search effort, played old interview clips out of context, and interviewed a former security guard who claimed he'd seen trucks hauling steel drums into the woods after the mine had closed. None of it was verifiable, but to their audience, it didn't need to be. The views climbed into the millions. 2 months later, Digging Deeper returned to Elk Valley, this time in secret. They waited until the middle of the night and entered the forest using GPS coordinates from an old mining company easement map they had uncovered online. They weren't the first to trespass in those woods, but they were the first to find something. About 400 yards west of the main mine entrance, tucked beneath a collapsed culvert, they discovered a rusted ventilation shaft large enough to crawl through. Inside, they found a narrow incline, partially reinforced with rotting timber. They descended using climbing gear and headlamps, recording the entire thing on body-mounted cameras. For the first 20 minutes, the shaft was uneventful, just damp walls and fallen debris. Then something shifted. As one of the climbers pressed his hand against the rock, a section of the wall gave way. Behind it, a concrete barrier, cleaner than the surrounding stone, smooth, too smooth. One of the others ran a gloved hand along the seam and tapped it, hollow. The footage, later leaked online, shows them prying at the edge with a crowbar until a crack forms. That's when the collapse started. A soft groan from above, then a thunderous rush of dust and rock. The team panicked. 2 of them scrambled up the shaft, barely making it out. The third was trapped, injured but alive, until local authorities, alerted by an anonymous 911 call, arrived hours later. When first responders reached the site, they didn't just find the injured explorer. They found the exposed face of something long buried. A concrete tunnel, now partially visible behind the collapsed rock wall. Reinforced, man-made, and absolutely not part of the original mine plans on record. It was curved, sloping downward, and unlike anything documented in the 1970s closure reports. For years, people had talked about sealed chambers and hidden shafts, but this was the first physical evidence. The footage spread like wildfire. News crews descended. Law enforcement cordoned off the area and launched a formal investigation for the first time in over a decade. In the following days, experts from the state's Department of Natural Resources and a federal mining safety team arrived to assess the site. Initial readings confirmed what was already suspected. The tunnel had been constructed post-closure, likely during the late 1970s or early 80s. The materials used were consistent with military surplus, corrugated steel and reinforced concrete, but why it existed or who built it remained unanswered. No records, no permits, just a sealed passage descending into the earth, hidden behind a wall someone had gone to great lengths to disguise. For the first time in over 20 years, the conversation changed. Theories once dismissed as conspiracy were now being revisited. And for the families who had waited through decades of silence, this sealed tunnel meant one thing: they were finally close to the truth, or to whatever had been buried with it. Once the tunnel was exposed, the state wasted no time. Within 48 hours, the area was fenced off and placed under 24-hour surveillance. Federal mining safety inspectors, forensic technicians, and structural engineers arrived from Charleston and Quantico. What had begun as an internet-fueled stunt was now a fully active investigation with the highest levels of oversight. The passage, quickly dubbed Tunnel Zero by officials, was unlike anything they'd encountered before. It wasn't part of the dry rock mine's historical blueprints. It didn't match the construction materials used during its operational years. And, most notably, it appeared to have been deliberately hidden, sealed behind a false wall, and insulated in ways that suggested someone had gone to extreme lengths to ensure it wouldn't be found. The first entry into Tunnel Zero was cautious. Ground stability was questionable, and air quality readings were erratic. A reinforced camera drone was sent in first, trailing behind a remote cable. It navigated the first 60 feet without obstruction, then revealed what looked like a small living chamber, walls coated with mold, rusted metal furniture, and scraps of fabric scattered across the floor. The air was damp and heavy with decay. The team watched from outside as the footage flickered through low light and sudden static. They saw a series of bunk-style metal bed frames, the springs long corroded. Children's shoes sat in pairs beneath one of the cots. A child-sized jacket had been folded carefully and placed near the wall. And then the camera tilted upward, revealing a cluster of hand-carved markings above the bed frames. Tally marks, hundreds of them, some etched deeply, others so faint they had almost disappeared into the concrete. The following day, a hazmat team made the first human entry. Equipped with oxygen tanks and biological suits, they walked the length of the corridor and confirmed what the footage had hinted at. This space had been lived in. Not recently, but long enough to leave a physical story behind. Carvings along the far wall listed 4 names. One was incomplete, only the first 3 letters visible. Kev. Next to it, a second name had been gouged in jagged letters, Cody. The other 2 were harder to read, partially eroded, but the placement and size suggested they had all been written by the same small hand. The team also noted a rusted metal pail in the corner, a makeshift toilet, and dozens of food cans, some military-issued, others generic brands from the early 1990s. None had been manufactured past 1995. Forensics sealed off the area and began processing the space inch by inch. Every object was tagged, cataloged, and photographed. DNA swabs were taken from clothing and wall residues. Footprints preserved in layers of silt were mapped and cast. All of it pointed to one horrifying truth. Someone, most likely children, had been kept in Tunnel 0. For how long, no one yet knew. But the tally marks, some counted into the hundreds, suggested weeks, maybe months. The absence of any electrical wiring or ventilation made it even more disturbing. This was not a bunker meant for survival. It was a cell. In one of the corners, investigators discovered a cracked cassette recorder coated in dust and mold. The tape inside had partially degraded, but lab teams were able to extract a segment. What they heard was barely audible beneath the static, but clear enough to transcribe a child's voice, hoarse and trembling, saying, "Day 16, we can't hear them anymore," followed by silence. Then the sound of slow, rhythmic tapping, as if someone had been knocking on the wall with a stone. News of the tunnel's discovery reignited national coverage. Reporters flooded Elk Valley, and old theories found new life. Questions swirled around who had built Tunnel 0, and more importantly, who had used it, and why it had been buried so deliberately. The families were briefed privately before the press conference. Lorraine Murphy, now in her 60s, asked only one question. Were they alone down there? No one could answer, but every detail recovered from the tunnel suggested intention: names carved, items arranged, clothes folded. It wasn't chaos, it was survival. Desperate, quiet survival. And whatever answers still lay beyond that tunnel, officials now knew they hadn't just found a hidden room. They had found a scene, a sealed, rotting chapter of a story long thought lost, now waiting to be read. 2 days after Tunnel 0 was opened, forensic crews uncovered a small rusted metal box wedged between 2 slabs of broken concrete behind the main chamber. It was corroded almost shut, but once opened, inside were 3 compact cassette tapes, each wrapped in a scrap of fabric, each labeled in fading ink. One read Eli, another Cody. The third had no name, just a date, 6/27/96. They were immediately sealed in evidence bags and rushed to a forensic audio lab in Charleston. Specialists knew the tapes were fragile. Mold had begun to eat away at the spools, and heat damage had warped parts of the casing. It took nearly a week to clean, stabilize, and digitize the contents. When the audio finally played, the room went still. The first tape began with static, then a faint hum. A boy's voice, young, nasal, maybe 11 or 12, spoke in broken sentences. His breathing was ragged. He said they were hurt, that they'd been down there for days or maybe a week. Then a pause. He said they'd been pushed, that it was a man in blue, like a uniform, or coveralls. He said they were told to be quiet, or it would get worse. His voice broke, and then he just cried. The tape continued for 47 minutes, filled mostly with silence and faint sounds, metal scraping, coughing, footsteps on stone. At one point, Another voice whispered something unintelligible, and then the first voice said, "He's coming back." The rest was static. The second tape was different. It began with singing, a soft, shaky version of "You Are My Sunshine." The voice cracked and faded, like the boy was trying to remember lyrics to keep calm. Then silence. Then a sudden thud, followed by coughing, wet, labored coughing. At the 13-minute mark, water could be heard dripping. Then a low clinking sound, repeated in a pattern, like someone was tapping a rock or metal against a pipe. That went on for several minutes. The tape ended without warning, the final sounds being what analysts described as rapid breathing and the dragging of something heavy. The third tape, the one dated just 5 days after the boys were reported missing, was harder to parse. It was badly degraded, but contained fragments, someone saying a name over and over again, though the name itself was unclear. There were long stretches of silence, interrupted by distant moans or calls. Investigators later described it as the most difficult to listen to, not because of what was said, but because of the inescapable impression that the boys had been left alone for far too long, trying to document something they didn't understand, using the only thing they had. Audio forensic experts matched the voice profiles to surviving family recordings, birthday party videos, old voicemails, school plays. Voice print analysis was conducted. DNA swabs from items found in the tunnel, including a toothbrush and bloodstains on a blanket, were compared to surviving relatives. Results came back conclusive. The voices on the tapes belonged to Eli Murphy and Cody Bell. A third, less clear voice was strongly suspected to be Travis, but there wasn't enough clear vocal material to verify. This was the first time in 23 years that the boys had been definitively placed inside the mine. And more chillingly, it was clear they had survived the initial disappearance. The tapes were not released publicly, but family members were given the option to hear them. Lorraine Murphy listened alone, behind a closed door at the sheriff's office, seated at the same desk where she had once pleaded for a second week of search funding. She listened to her son's voice tremble through the hiss of old tape, whispering about the dark, about waiting, about someone who never came back. She didn't cry, not then. When she emerged, she said nothing, just asked if the third tape had been translated yet. The media learned about the recordings within days. Headlines ran with phrases like "tunnel confession" and "voices from below," twisting the discovery into something sensational. But for the families, it wasn't about the tapes being proof of a crime or mystery. It was confirmation of the unthinkable, that the boys had lived, had waited, had tried to tell their story, even when the world above them had gone quiet. And for the investigators, the implications were immediate. If someone had put them down there, if someone in blue had sealed them away, then someone still alive had the answers. Because the boys hadn't simply vanished into the woods, they had been buried, alive, with only a cassette recorder to leave behind what no one would listen to in time. It was an engineer from the federal mining team who noticed the change in air pressure. While mapping the far end of Tunnel Zero, just beyond where the boys' makeshift living quarters ended, he detected a faint draft seeping through a wall that looked like a natural collapse. On closer inspection, it wasn't. Beneath the rubble was a sealed vertical shaft, narrow, lined with rusted steel, and reinforced with a welded metal lid at the top. A few inches of rebar jutted out where the concrete had cracked with age. It had been shut intentionally, and not from the inside. The team spent 2 days carefully dismantling the seal. Every piece of rebar was cut under supervision. When they finally exposed the top of the shaft, the first thing they saw was a rusted ladder descending into darkness. About 30 feet down, the rungs ended at a small, flat chamber, just wide enough to kneel in. At the bottom were 4 sets of skeletal remains, partially buried in sediment and debris, each one positioned separately as if they had curled into themselves. The bones were fragile. Some disarticulated, others still partially clothed, remnants of cotton shirts, elastic bands from underwear, the heel of a small sneaker, faded but still marked with a blue stripe. Investigators lowered lights and began photographing every inch before recovery began. Near the center of the chamber, beside what was believed to be the oldest boy's remains, was a decaying satchel. Inside was a rusted flashlight, an empty can of Vienna sausages, and a small metal badge fused to a melted plastic clip. When cleaned, the badge revealed the name C. Mercer, a former mine safety inspector who had worked for the Elk Valley Coal Authority until 1997. His file, retrieved within hours, showed he'd gone on leave shortly after the mine's final security audit in late '96. He had been questioned early in the original investigation, but provided an alibi and was never considered a suspect. He died by suicide in 1999. A report from that year noted the method, carbon monoxide poisoning, and stated he left no note, but now his name was back in the center of the case, and this time there were no questions about his proximity to the mine. He'd been down there. The badge proved it. Investigators began piecing together what might have happened. Mercer had been one of the few people with unrestricted access to the dry rock mine system after its closure. He had reviewed structural reports, inspected hidden shafts, and signed off on final sealing operations. According to his logs, the shaft now known as Tunnel Zero wasn't even listed, but older drafts, buried in archived company files, showed a proposed ventilation corridor approved but never completed. Except now it was clear that it had been completed, quietly, without oversight. The construction materials used matched surplus military specs from a federal stockpile program in use through the late 1980s. Whoever built the tunnel had access to resources and secrecy. Autopsies of the remains confirmed what no one wanted to hear. None of the boys had suffered violent trauma. All died from dehydration and starvation, likely over the course of several weeks. The position of the bodies and the evidence in Tunnel Zero suggested they had first been held in the living chamber, then later moved, or had moved themselves, into the shaft in a failed attempt to escape. The latter was intact. The seal above them, however, was not. It was reinforced with welded plates and rebar, likely done from the surface. They had been trapped with no way out. Why Mercer did what he did, if he acted alone, or if he was following someone's orders, was something no one could answer definitively. But the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. He had a motive. He signed off on the mine's safety records and had reason to fear the repercussions if children were found inside. He had means. He knew the access points, knew how to seal a shaft properly, and had the keys to equipment stored on site. And he had an opportunity. He was last documented at the mine the same week the boys vanished. His death in 1999, just 3 years later, now looked less like tragedy and more like an escape from consequences he may have feared were coming. The discovery of the shaft, the badge, and the remains brought closure, but it also reopened a raw wound. The families had spent nearly 3 decades begging someone to look deeper, and in the end, the boys hadn't wandered off. They hadn't been taken by a stranger or lost to the wilderness. They had been hidden in a hole in the ground, less than a mile from where they were last seen, buried alive by a man trusted to keep the mine safe. For investigators, it was the final puzzle piece. But for the mothers who waited, who searched the ridgelines and funded scans and stood at press conferences, it wasn't a revelation. It was confirmation of what they'd feared all along. That the mine hadn't just failed to protect their children, it had swallowed them whole, and someone had poured concrete over the silence. The final report was released quietly, nearly 4 months after the remains were recovered. It spanned over 200 pages, compiling forensic data, mine blueprints, personnel records, and timelines reconstructed from decades-old paperwork and audio analysis. But despite the weight of documentation, one thing remained unprovable: motive. Investigators stopped short of calling it murder. There was no direct evidence that the mine inspector, Curtis Mercer, intended to kill the boys. What they concluded instead was that he likely panicked. The leading theory was this: sometime in the late afternoon of June 10, 1996, the boys accessed the unsecured shaft near the rear slope of the dry rock mine. Mercer, who was known to be conducting a solo inspection that week, discovered them either before or after a minor collapse. Whether one of the boys was injured or whether they had stumbled into a restricted zone remains unknown. But Mercer, fearing the fallout of a safety breach, may have made the decision to isolate the site, sealing off the shaft while the boys were still inside. The theory was supported by the timeline. Mercer filed a vague incident report that same day, citing unauthorized entry signs near West Slope, but never named any individuals. He returned the following morning to supervise welding contractors who sealed what was recorded as a minor vent. No one questioned him. He was nearing retirement, regarded as thorough, and the mine was already set for decommissioning. But the problem with secrets buried underground is they don't stay buried forever. When the Attorney General's office held its press conference, the language was clinical. They called it a gross failure of oversight, a systemic lapse in site security, and an avoidable tragedy. The families were seated in the front row. Lorraine Murphy sat with her hands clasped, a photo of Eli folded in her lap. No charges were filed. Mercer had been dead for more than 20 years, and no direct accomplices were identified. But the state did something it had never done before. It apologized. A formal letter was issued to each family, acknowledging that records had been lost, that inspections had failed, and that for decades, a critical piece of evidence, the tunnel itself, had been concealed by negligence, if not intent. In Elk Valley, the news was met with a heavy kind of silence, not disbelief, not even outrage, just a deep, exhausted understanding. Everyone had known in some unspoken way that the mine had played a role, that it hadn't just swallowed the boys, it had swallowed the truth. A local memorial was approved within weeks. The site of Tunnel Zero, now stabilized and sealed in reinforced concrete, was marked with a small bronze plaque bearing 4 names: Eli and Travis Murphy, Kevin Fields, Cody Bell. The plaque sits flush against the rock, barely visible from the trail, but those who know exactly where to find it. The ceremony held in early spring was brief. No speeches, just family, a few officials and members of the original search teams, older now, some retired, some walking with canes. They stood in silence for several minutes as a recording played softly nearby. It was the audio of Eli's voice, cleaned up by forensic teams, repeating the same words from the tape they had recovered. "We're still here." For Lorraine, it was the line that haunted her most, and the one that finally gave her peace, because they had been. All along, the case was closed shortly after, not with satisfaction, but with resolution. No arrests, no trials, but closure in the form of knowing. Knowing that the boys didn't run, that they didn't vanish into the wilderness or slip through the cracks of some unspeakable mystery. They were right there, beneath the surface, waiting for someone to listen, to believe, and finally, to dig deep enough to bring them home. 29 years later, they were found. And the secret Mercer tried to bury, sealed in concrete, hidden behind falsified maps and silence, was no longer his to keep.